You're living in a colder winter morning back in 1250 C. You're 19 years of age, and you attend University of Paris as a student. You wake in the middle of the night in a small boarding house. You can see your breath in the cold air. Last meal you had was on the previous day at about noon. You're going to sit through 2 hours of lectures in total darkness with no published notes. Your lecture notes are all in the language of Latin and are completely based off the philosophy of Aristotle. You may think of a university experience in modern day will not resemble that of students and professors of European universities during the Middle Ages. And before you get too comfortable, I want to begin describing what was a typical day of existence for both students and professors at Europe's first universities. If you think waking up to an 8 o'clock lecture is difficult, the medieval students would speak against that word. The average day began at dawn, typically about 5 to 6 a.m., with an ordinary lecture that lasted 2 hours. In Paris, the early morning lecture was done in darkness intentionally, and students were not allowed to take notes or use any form of written record. The professor gave his lecture entirely from memory. Students could only use their ability to listen attentively, understand, and remember everything from a lecture before they could eat breakfast, in total darkness, and all of the lectures were in medieval Latin. There was no breakfast served at Oxford and Cambridge until 10 a.m. Therefore, students had to endure 4 hours of very difficult lectures while still hungry. Students would receive 1 hour of breakfast after the first set of lectures, then continue with more lectures from noon until 5 p.m., resulting in an 8 to 9 hour day with lectures for 6 days each week. In addition to the number of hours spent listening to lectures, students were also expected to have learned a great deal. Students were taught about the 7 liberal arts of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, which were taught exclusively in Latin. Scholasticism was the primary method of teaching in medieval universities. This method involved a combination of readings from recognized sources by the lecturer, followed by individual reflection by the student, and lastly, formal disputations in which the student presented arguments both for and against the thesis. Because books were very costly, each student could purchase only 3 or 4 volumes at most. The method of learning was largely oral in nature. You listened, you remembered, or you failed. However, as most medieval university towns also served as trade centers, during the periods of free time after lectures, they often became the most violent and dangerous locations in all of Europe. The struggles of students and their corresponding town are complex. Students in the Middle Ages existed within a particular type of legal status that provided them with their own set of exemptions, i.e., students were considered clerics. Therefore, they were not able to be judged by civil courts, did not owe any form of excise tax to the local government, and were ultimately responsible to only the officials of the respective university. Townspeople enjoyed seeing drunken students defiling public property, fighting amongst themselves, and committing crimes without facing any repercussions for it. Jacques de Vitry, who attended the University of Paris around 1200, provided us with one of the most detailed accounts of the situation. He provided information about ethnic tensions between student nations, which were formed based on a student group's geographic location, representing their university experience. Each group used vulgarizations to describe the others. The English were depicted as drunken lowlifes with tails, the French as effeminized, the Germans as vulgar and infuriated. The Lombards were considered greedy and cowardly. He noted that the hostility often escalated from verbal assaults to physical altercations. However, the conflict did not only exist between student groups. An example of this was shown at the University of Oxford on February 10, 1355, during the Battle of St. Scholastica's Day, where an altercation in a bar magnified when students threw a cup of wine at the tavern owner, resulting in a 2-day battle. With their bows and arrows, local citizens attacked the academic institution. Dozens of scholars were killed or disabled. The university's power in medieval society can be seen in the long-term ramifications. The University of Oxford's mayor and bailiffs had to attend a mass each year to honor the deceased scholars and make an oath to uphold the university's privileges for the next 500 years, not an exaggeration, until the year 1825. The University of Cambridge was created as a result of violence. In 1209, the violence at Oxford caused many scholars to leave when the townspeople executed 2 innocent scholars for the actions of a student in killing a townswoman. The violence was not simply youthful pranks, but was pervasive and systemic, making university towns unsafe to be in during the Middle Ages.
Every student faces the same challenge: money. Surviving the violence of medieval Europe was not the only big challenge. Students have always been poor and have always been forced to ask their parents for money. In fact, we have hundreds of surviving letters from medieval students. An Italian father once wrote, "A student's first song is a request for money." Every letter will be full of requests for cash. In 1220, a student at Oxford wrote, "Money is very much standing in the way of my advancement. It has been 2 months since I last spent any of the money you sent me. There are a lot of expenses in this city. You should know that without Ceres and Bacchus, Apollo gets cold." In Italian, that means, without food and wine, a student will be cold. Even while begging for money, students were proud of their education. However, they had a good reason to beg for money. In the 15th century, studying at Bologna cost approximately 60 florins per year. It was equivalent to the annual earnings of a middle-class tailor. In the 13th century, 4 years at a university cost from 48 to 64 florins. A day laborer made about 10 florins a year. One letter showed that students in Bologna had to beg from house to house through the horrible mud, with no guarantee of bringing anything home unless God went with him. The way students lived was diverse. Early students rented rooms in private houses and had no supervision, while in the 13th century, supervised residences called bursae, or colleges, were created for students, where they were regulated by their masters who controlled their daily behavior through strict disciplines. The most affluent students could pay up to 10 guilders a year, while those less fortunate paid only 2 guilder a year, or were permitted exemption from fees entirely. The extremely poor students resided in almshouses. Many of these students were genuinely impoverished, and they engaged in various types of employment to support themselves, including working as servants, copying manuscripts, singing at churches, or begging to keep alive. If you're intrigued by this assessment of what it was like to be a university student over 800 years ago, please hit like. And if you'd like to learn more about medieval history, please subscribe. We'll now discuss how graduation costs were a cause for bankruptcy to families. To get to graduate from school was 1. Be financially able to. 2. There were no written exams to get a bachelor's degree. Students were supposed to study 3 to 4 years, then confirm they listened to the lectures. Simple as that. Master's degrees required a bit more work, including a public argument, disputation, and presenting a lecture. The fact is that most students didn't get to graduation because they didn't complete the main event that allowed them to proceed: inceptions. The inception ceremony welcomed a new teacher into the teaching guild. This wasn't just the handing of a diploma and shaking hands. It was an elaborate medieval celebration on par with royal weddings in size and scope. In addition to a diploma, new masters had to throw an inception dinner with up to 100 guests. The halls were decorated with brightly colored streamers, gold-accented pillars, and gold-fringed canopies. The food was magnificent. Items on the menu included roasted wild pig, roasted forest deer, roasted bears, pyramids of delicious seasoned pigeons, roasted swans, roasted rabbits, roasted venison. Minstrels performed music as people ate and danced. At Bologna, students who were enthusiastic about their friend's graduation carried him through the city triumphantly, with pipers and trumpeters preceding them. The expense for this was occasionally as much as 100 or 200 guilders, which is approximately 10 or 20 years of income for a day laborer. Many students could not afford to do this and graduated with no degrees. The medieval university therefore developed a system that permitted only rich people to graduate officially, even though poorer people had fulfilled all educational requirements. Jacques de Vitry was unimpressed with the whole situation. He stated that most students did nothing but learn or hear something new. Some studied for the sake of knowledge and were curious, while others were studying to become famous and were vain, and still others were studying to obtain a profit and were greedy. He also criticized professors as being swelled with learning and hating one another, and competing for their students without having any regard for the welfare of their students' souls. Thus, even in the 13th century, there were complaints about the academic political system and the commercialism of academia.
The medieval university created an international intellectual community of students and master instructors across Europe. They taught students rigorous reasoning through systematic argumentation in the form of logical disputation. Academic standards were established that have been maintained to this day. Doctoral degrees, structured curricula, academic freedom and autonomy of the university as a corporation. The liberal arts curriculum, master's degree, and many of the ceremonial elements of graduation can be traced back to the medieval universities. Note that the times were very difficult. Being a student was costly, and most students never had food to eat and had no way of seeing what they were writing on papers except the faint light of candle flames. Most of all, they had no rights. Many times, a townsperson would challenge a student or instructor to duel. These young men begged their parents for money using eloquent Latin. These young men lived in horrendous poverty, and many of them didn't finish school because they couldn't pay for their graduation banquet. There was, however, something new about these schools. They would take young men from a variety of assorted backgrounds, provide them with access to an international scholarly community, with fellow scholars residing in many kingdoms, languages, and social classes, and bring them together into a single group. The institutions created the model for future colleges and universities. If you liked this investigation into how medieval universities operated, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my analytical view of history. What are the other things you want to learn about on a day-to-day basis during the medieval era? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. You can go to the sources linked below for more information, and I will see you again soon.